Hey everyone, it's me Metal, and today I shall be doing a new series called Metal Reads, or something along those lines, and I shall be reading, yeah. And pretty much what I'm going to do is, each video is going to be a chapter, so yeah, and I'm planning on reading straight through with cuts in between each chapter, so yeah. That's what I'm planning on doing. So, yeah. Today I'm going to be reading Chasers of the Wind by Alexey Pehov. And let's start off with the prologue. And sorry if I pronounce names or words wrong. And yeah. So, hope you enjoy. Luck had been unlucky last night. He had to take over someone else's shift, and as a result, he hadn't had nearly enough sleep. Huddled against the early morning chill, the guard jiggled his leg and chafed his cold fingers into his mittens. Every other second his thoughts turned to the grand party that had been organized for the fifth barracks in honor of a feast of a name. Most of the garrison was planning to start celebrating early this morning, but here he was, occupied with this nonsense. Such a toad, muttered the soldier. If the commander was so afraid of absent enemies, then why didn't he order the gates to be closed? These past few years, the vast 40-yard high wings had stood wide open, even during the night, and not a single rat had dared to sneak through. What was the point of strengthening the watch if it would be far simpler to just lower the porticles? Damn that stupid commander. Damn the sergeant. Muttering curses under his breath, Luke moved along the wall from the tower of ice to the tower of fire. Along the way he gave a nod to his friends, who were drunk on chaff, giving half an ear to the usual little jokes and remarks addressed to him, lazily straggling and then moving on somewhat quicker when they reminded him of his debts. Luck had no love for returning money. The Gates of Six Towers was the greatest fortress in the world, constructed by the sculptor himself, and it guarded the only passage through the western region of the Boxwood Mountains. The famed citadel had withstood many an onslaught over its 1,000-year history, but had never been taken. The army of Nabator had broken its teeth against the grey stones and lost many warriors in process. Causing the fortress to surrender would require something more forceful than steel and bravery. While the gates exist, the soft underbelly of the empire remains safeguarded. Luke watched his two women exited the Tower of Rain onto the wall. A walker and an ember. The mages were conversing about something, and the guard paused, reluctant to interrupt their conversation, and he turned away toward an arrow loop, scrutinizing the scene before him. He had been born in a small prairie village, and even now, 6 years after he first saw the snow-covered peaks, he never tired of marveling at the beauty of the mountain heights. The gates, situated between two ridges, bridged in the entrance to the lower lands, where the route into the heart of the country began. In former times, multitudes of caverns had made the journey to the south. Weapons, silks, carpets, spices, horses, and hundreds of other wares passed through the gates to distant countries beyond. But that golden age had long since passed, and the route had dried up. Only the local herdsmen, as well as the scouts that the commander kept sending into the nearby ravines, ever dared to venture along the old route and ascend into the inhospitable mountains. But something strange had been going on with the scouts recently. The second squad of Northerners was already late, even though it was long past the deadline when they should have returned. The commander was taking his frustration out on the captains, and they constantly were taking it out on the sergeants and the common soldiers. The guard, unlike the officers, secretly rejoiced that the squad in which the red-haired Ganor served was still wandering around the neighboring environs. Luke owed the Northerner money, but he didn't have very much money at the moment. He'd blown too much of it on the dice last time. Almost all of his wages had disappeared into his debts, into other people's purses. Screw a toad. All there was in his purse right now was one soul, and that was not nearly enough money for Ganor. But he had to find a way to pay him back. The Northerners were straightforward people, and if everything wasn't just so, he'd get it right in the choppers. The soldier leaned out of the arrow loop and spat with relish. He followed the spittle with his eyes, hoping it would land on some heedless idiot, but to Luke's intense disappointment, there was no one standing under the wall. For the 100th time since that morning, he swore an oath and then resumed his completion of the landscape. A small town was spread out in front of the gates. The humble dwellings were constructed of round stones and clay, which had been taken from the banks of the nearby mountain river. The families of shepherds, wool merchants, and silver miners lived in the settlement. The villagers were not frightened to be living on the very edge of the empire. The fortress was impregnable. The soldiers experienced. None of the mountain tribes would bother them here. They had already taken it on the nose more than once, and they knew that they couldn't seize the gates. It would be quicker to gnaw a passage under the mountains than to tear down the mighty walls of the impregnable fortress. Despite the fact that it was early summer, the air smelled slightly of frost. Rays of sunlight painted the snowy heights of the mountains with rose. The peaks were shrouded in clouds. The sun was slowly climbing up from behind the eastern range. Another minute passed. The sun began to shine brightly on the summits that Luke screwed his eyes shut once again called on his toad. When the guard opened his eyes, he saw that two skinny mules, hauling an old caravan, had appeared on the empty morning road. From such a height, the caravan was no bigger than the palm of his hand, but Luke could clearly make out a woman sitting on the driver's seat. She was dressed almost entirely in rags. She looked just like a stuffed scarecrow. The soldier frowned in confusion. Had one of the villagers taken it into her head and set off for Alexey Ford? It was 18 legs away. It would be stupid to haul wool to the fair, which had been arranged in honor of the feast of the name. To have any chance of trading goods, she should have set out 6 days earlier. Now she was just wasting the labor of her animals for nothing. Even as she hurried, she'd get there far after the trading had ended. A strange caravan. He didn't recognize it. And that old woman, more like a beggar than anything else. Luke frowned, trying to recall if there was anyone in town who had two such amicated mules, not to mention caravan with a blue top. A quick rundown of all his acquaintances' names and nicknames gave him nothing. If a guard could trust his memory, he'd never seen such a piece of junk. And after all the time he served here, standing by the wing, the soldier knew everyone who did business at Alexey Ford quite well. One of two things was going on. First, she could be someone who traveled to the town while it wasn't his shift. Secondly, the unfamiliar wagon could have come out of the pass and therefore from Nabator itself. The strange wagon still had about 200 yards left until it reached the gates, when he called out to a friend who was chatting with two other guards. "Hey, Rec!" "What?" he responded petulantly. "Take a look." Rec grumbled discontentedly, but all the same he turned in the direction indicated. For several seconds he watched the road apathetically, and then he turned his gaze on Luke. "What of it?" "Do you know her?" "No." "Neither do I. You think she came from the pass?" Overhearing something about the pass, Vasily's shoulders leaned toward the arrow loop. "The captain should be informed," Rex said uncertainly. "You should go inform him yourself," muttered Luke. But then he replied, "Shut down below. Get them to check who it is and what she's doing here." Rex turned away from the arrow loop, brought his hands to his mouth, and bellowed to the guards standing in the exterior courtyard of a fortress. At the very instant, a captain emerged from the barracks with his 20 unfortunate wretches who were doomed to work on the holiday. Meanwhile, two guards stepped away from the wall and slowly made their way toward the caravan. Another dozen, mostly just curious, stood by the wing. The woman tugged at the reins and said something in reply to the soldiers' questions. Luke would have paid a lot of money to hear exactly what was said, but a moment later he saw 8 men emerge from the caravan. 6 of them were dressed in chainmail and armed to the teeth. But it was the sight of the other 2 that froze the blood in Luke's veins and sent shooting pains throughout his stomach. They were wearing white robes. Necromancers, stis. The guard wanted to call out to catch the attention of the walkers, but fear made his voice seize in his throat. Unable to rip his gaze away, he watched as the warriors, dressed in the colors of the kingdom of Nabator, killed the surprised soldiers and started running toward the fortress. A battle broke out below. Something snapped, howled, hissed, and the captain and his men were swept through the courtyard of the citadel in bloody scrapes. The staff of one of the citizens' soldiers were emitting a grey light. Once again there was a rumbling, though not as loud as before, and all that remained of Necromancer and the Nabatorian standing closest to him was a wet spot. The walker was invoking her gift, and the ember was standing next to her, pressing her palm into the lady's back. "The gates! Close the gates! Screw a damn toad!" called out Luke, who had finally came to his senses. From the direction of the village, he could see a few hundred cavalry galloping at full tilt towards the gates. Alongside the Nabatorians, keeping pace with horses, ran bony creatures that resembled skeletons. Morts! Rick ran to an enormous horn, breathed deeply, gathering the air in his lungs, and then blew it. A low booming sound spread throughout the towers, sounding the alarm and raising the entire garrison to its feet. Men ran in from every quarter with no idea what was happening. Many of them were without weapons. The wings of the gates finally shriveled shivered and slowly began to close. Too slowly. Beneath the walls, the battle raged on. The 6 Nabatorian warriors under the as pieces of the remaining necromancer were holding out until the arrival of main force. A lower protocols rumbled, and then another, and then there was a roar, and a warning cry rang through the fortress courtyard. The sorcerer blew up the protocols! Things were looking bleak if the walker didn't do something soon. As if in response to Luke's entreaty, the air simmered and thickened over the Lady and the Ember, transforming into a massive, many-faced spear of ice. It developed, aimed for the citizen. Then the woman who was sitting on the caravan seat thrust up one of her hands, as if annoyed at the distraction from her completion of the combat. Crash! For a moment, it seemed to Luke that he had died and found himself in the drum of the Northerner's god. Ugh. There was a ringing in his ears, and all around him hung a thick cloud of dust. Bewildered at first, the guard realized that he had fallen. He shook his head dazedly, and then got up onto his hands and knees. There was a roaring in his ears, and blood was pouring down his face, spitting out grit. He staggered to his feet and rushed towards where the walker had been standing. Enormous stones, which had been sent into the walls by the sculptor, had been plucked out and scattered for hundreds of yards. One of the boulders had fallen on the barricades of a second company, reducing it to rubble. Another, launched as if it was from a catapult, had crashed through the facade of the Tower of Rain. A third had smashed down onto the road, crushing 3 heedless Morts and 5 Nabatorians along with their horses. The section of the wall on which the magic blue had fallen was severely damaged. It was as if a giant hammer had struck it, but the walker was alive. Forgetting about his usual shyness around those who possessed the gift, Luke rushed over to the woman, and then he shuddered. He had never seen such wounds during his time as a guard, and he strived to look only at the woman's face. Only now did he appreciate the fact that she was no more than 19 years old, and that she had sky-blue eyes. She smiled, and very quietly, but astonishingly clear, said, "Tell my sisters that Rubiola has returned." "A damned! Are you sure, my lady?" babbled Luke, who was suffocating from terror. The walker did not answer. Her eyes faded, and for some reason the guard had the strongest urge to cry. A succession of magical blows battered against the gates. They remained intact, but stopped closing. The forward detachment of Nabatorians had held out long enough to ensure that cavalry and Morts swept into the courtyard. A massacre ensued. Over and over, the citizen's staff flared dully. The damned just sat on the caravan seat and watched in a bored manner as an endless blue-black ribbon of soldiers flowed into the fallen citadel.